The fire chief gave him 30 minutes to restore the hydrant pressure, or the whole block burned. Callahan Reyes had $7, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a municipal water system maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any fire hydrant he passed for signs of proper pressure. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten infrastructure that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the small municipal utility that employed him privatized its maintenance division, eliminating his entire position in a single afternoon. He had been moving through small towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The privatization decision had come with barely 2 weeks' notice, and Callahan had spent the 8 months since relearning, town by town, that his particular skill with municipal water infrastructure mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. He had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure his whole life, his own father having maintained municipal water systems for nearly 3 decades before him. And he had learned, riding along on service calls from an early age, the particular gravity of a system most people never once thought about until the exact moment it failed to deliver water precisely when it mattered most. He arrived at the edge of a small commercial block in the town of Hartwell Crossing to find smoke already rising from a storefront 2 buildings down, fire trucks positioned along the street, and a fire chief shouting frantically at a firefighter struggling with a hydrant that produced nothing but a weak, useless trickle of water. The air already carried the acrid smell of burning wood and melting vinyl siding, and Callahan could see, even from a distance, the particular urgency of firefighters working with equipment that wasn't giving them nearly enough to actually contain what they were facing. "I need pressure now," the chief was shouting. "This fire spreads to the adjoining buildings in the time it takes us to figure out what's wrong with this main." "Rough afternoon?" Callahan asked, jogging up to the chief despite the obvious chaos. The chief turned, momentarily startled by the unexpected question amid the emergency. "You could say that. Name's Otis Marsh. This hydrant's main feed has lost pressure entirely, right when we need every gallon we can get onto that fire before it spreads to the block's remaining buildings. I've got 30 minutes, maybe less, before this becomes a fire we genuinely can't contain with what water we're currently able to draw." "What's actually feeding this hydrant?" Callahan asked. "I used to do municipal water system maintenance. I might be able to help, if the problem's in the supply line rather than the hydrant itself. There's a control valve somewhere along this block that regulates flow to this whole section," Otis said. "I don't know its exact location, and I don't have anyone on my crew trained in the water system itself rather than firefighting equipment." "How much of that 30 minutes is actually left?" Callahan asked, already scanning the street for anything resembling infrastructure access. 22 minutes by my last check," Otis said. "The fire's contained to the one storefront for now, but the wall separating it from the adjoining building isn't going to hold much longer without considerably more water than we're currently managing to put on it." "Show me where the main line runs," Callahan said. "If a valve's failed or been closed somehow, that's fixable, assuming we can find it fast enough." Otis led him to a manhole cover near the block's edge, and Callahan dropped down into the access chamber, finding, exactly as he'd suspected, a large control valve that appeared to have been closed. Whether through mechanical failure or some earlier maintenance work, nobody had properly documented reopening afterward. The chamber itself was cramped and poorly lit, forcing Callahan to work largely by feel and the faint light of his own phone, understanding that whatever time this awkward positioning cost him was time the fire crew above genuinely couldn't afford to lose. "This valve's shut," Callahan called up. "I don't know why yet, but I can open it manually if the mechanism itself hasn't seized." He worked the valve's manual override with considerable effort, understanding that decades of potential disuse could have left the mechanism stiff enough to resist easy movement, and felt it finally begin to turn under his sustained pressure, the valve opening incrementally as he continued working it toward its full position, his own hands straining against corrosion that had clearly gone unaddressed for years. "Check the hydrant!" Callahan shouted up. "Tell me the moment you see pressure returning." A shout came back within seconds. "We've got water, considerably more than we had a minute ago." Callahan continued working the valve to its fully open position, understanding that partial opening might provide some pressure, but considerably less than the fire crews actually needed to fully contain a spreading fire. By the time he climbed back out of the access chamber, the hydrant was producing a strong, steady stream that the firefighters were already directing toward the burning storefront, with considerably more effect than their earlier efforts had managed. "That's exactly what we needed," Otis said, watching his crew work the fire with renewed intensity. "I don't know how you found that valve so quickly, but you likely just saved this entire block from becoming a considerably larger fire than what we're currently fighting." The fire crew brought the blaze under control within the following hour, the restored water pressure making the difference between a contained single-building fire and what had genuinely threatened to become a block-wide catastrophe. Callahan watched from a respectful distance as the crew worked, understanding that his own part in the emergency had ended the moment the water started flowing properly, the rest belonging entirely to the trained firefighters doing the actual dangerous work of containing the blaze itself. The storefront's owner, a woman who had watched the entire ordeal from across the street with her hands pressed to her mouth, approached Callahan once the smoke finally began to clear, her voice thick with an emotion considerably larger than simple gratitude. "That's my whole livelihood in there," she told him. 20 years building this business, and I watched it come within minutes of losing everything to a fire that could have taken the whole block with it. I don't know your name, but I don't think I'll ever forget what you did this afternoon. I don't know how to properly thank you for what you did today," Otis told Callahan, once the fire was fully extinguished and the crews had begun their cleanup. 30 minutes, and you found a problem my own crew had no way of diagnosing, let alone fixing, in the time we actually had. I think your crew's own firefighting saved this block as much as anything I did," Callahan said. "I simply happened to know where to look for the actual water supply problem." Word of the near catastrophe and its narrow prevention spread through Hartwell Crossing within days, and the town council, once informed of exactly how close the block had come to a considerably larger fire over a control valve nobody had properly documented or maintained, agreed to fund a full survey of the town's remaining water infrastructure, ensuring no future emergency could be complicated by similarly undocumented equipment. The council's own fire safety committee visited the site personally the following week, reviewing the incident alongside Chief Marsh's own account, and left visibly troubled by exactly how narrow the margin had actually been. 30 minutes, and no documented map of this block's own control valves, the committee chair said, examining the access chamber with evident discomfort at the town's own infrastructure gaps. "I don't think this town fully understood the risk we were carrying on undocumented water infrastructure until we very nearly learned it the hard way." "How many other sections of town have similarly undocumented valves?" Otis asked. "More than I'm comfortable admitting," the committee chair said. "I intend to make certain every control valve in this town gets properly mapped and documented, so no future fire crew ever has to gamble on a stranger happening to walk past with exactly the right knowledge." Callahan stayed on at Hartwell Crossing through that winter and the ones that followed, formally hired by the town to properly document and maintain the water system's remaining infrastructure, a position that gave him steady work and the particular satisfaction of ensuring no future emergency would face the same dangerous uncertainty his own quick diagnosis had barely overcome in time. He spent that first month mapping every control valve across the town's full water system, creating exactly the kind of documentation that should have existed decades earlier. understanding that his own repair had been as much luck as skill, given how little the town actually knew about its own infrastructure before that afternoon. He found, working through that mapping project, 3 additional valves in similarly undocumented condition elsewhere in town, each one a potential repeat of the exact crisis that had nearly cost the block its storefronts, and he addressed each one properly before any future emergency could test them, the way that afternoon's fire had tested the one beneath the burning block. This whole block still stands because you happened to be walking past on exactly the wrong afternoon, Otis told Callahan, some months later, watching the restored storefront reopen for business. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for that particular coincidence, however unlikely it seemed at the time. Callahan wrote to his own father that winter, describing the hydrant and the 30-minute deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine equipment check to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the privatization ended his own maintenance career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Callahan remembered him always being. Told you a good waterman's instinct for finding a valve quickly would find use somewhere, whatever the utility decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for keeping calm in an emergency when a whole block's worth of buildings depended on getting it right in less time than most people take, deciding what to eat for lunch. Callahan thought, some evenings that winter, about the 8 months of towns and privatization notices that had led him to a burning storefront on an ordinary afternoon, and understood, watching the town's fire hydrants tested and properly documented through drill after drill that followed, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose he'd feared he might never find again. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving with exactly 30 minutes to spare and making every single one of them count for an entire block that would never fully know how close it had come to burning considerably further than it actually did. He kept a small note tucked into his own toolkit after that. Simply the words 22 minutes written in his own hand. A private reminder of exactly how little time had actually separated an ordinary afternoon from a fire that could have taken an entire block rather than a single storefront. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many towns depend on water infrastructure so poorly documented that even trained firefighters can't quickly diagnose a failure in the exact moment it matters most? And what does it take? 30 minutes. A fire chief willing to accept an unexpected stranger's offer of help. A technician who understood exactly where to look for a valve nobody had properly mapped. For an entire block to survive a fire that very nearly became something considerably worse. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.